You are listening to Practical and Woo by Mindset and Manifest. My name is Eden, and I invite you to embark on a journey with me to explore the practical and spiritual edges of the unknown for the purpose of allowing you to embody and empower yourself uniquely as you are and to intentionally create and live a life of freedom and fulfillment. Each week, I'm going to discuss topics such as energetics, reality creation, manifestation, astrology, tarot, and more to help empower you to live beyond perceived limitations and to practically design your life so it feels like absolute magic every step of the way. Let's dive in.
Well, hello, brilliant soul. For so much of my life, it's felt like I've been situated in circumstances that have caused others to hold me to a different standard than they do other people. Ever since I was little, I would witness the ways that other kids, teens, adults could act, speak, behave in certain ways that would be overlooked for them. But for me, those very same actions would be the thing to land me in the hot seat. I grew up in a way that felt like I was placed under a very proficient microscope where I was being examined for everything I was doing wrong, but very rarely for what I was doing right. I can tell you honestly that this used to bother me a lot, and on occasion it still does, and it also felt incredibly and deeply unfair. I can also point to a number of astrological chart aspects in my own natal chart that I can qualify as the energetic reason for why I experienced this phenomenon. But today, I want to actually unpack why being held to a different standard, a different expectation than others, is actually a great blessing. A blessing we can consider an Everest climb and a blessing nonetheless. If you have found yourself drawn to this episode, then chances are you are in resonance with this sort of experience. So let's unpack why it's actually good to rise to the higher standard despite the initial pain of the perceived unfairness. What if being held to a higher standard means the architecture of your life is designed to hold more? There are people who can move through life loosely. They seem to be allowed to cut corners and act impulsively, throw tantrums with little perceived recourse. They're the ones who can make the same mistake twice, but be met with indulgent laughter. And then there are others who seem to receive immediate feedback, immediate correction, immediate consequence. The same action or behavior somehow lands differently. The same tone interpreted as being more sharp, the same misstep somehow carrying more weight for one rather than the other. And for those of us who have been the one observed, examined, scrutinized, this kind of discrepancy in treatment can be breeding grounds for resentment if we let it. Feeling as if things are unfair or uneven. But what if it's not truly uneven? What if this is an intentional calibration? I want to invite you for a moment to think about different structures or buildings. You won't test a garden shed for stability and capacity in the same way you would measure a skyscraper. You wouldn't build a footbridge with the same reinforcements that are required for a suspension bridge carrying thousands of cars, trucks, and tons every single day. The greater the intended height, the deeper the foundation must go. The more expansive the vision, the more precise the alignment must be. If you're someone who feels like you are corrected more often than others are, or asked to rise more quickly, or expected to regulate more deeply, it may be because the life you're building requires discipline at a different level. Perhaps the life you're desiring has features that require you to learn skills in the heat of the fire. If you're meant to lead, you cannot afford the same level of emotional reactivity that someone living a quieter calling might. If you're meant to build something significant, your integrity must be tight. If you're meant to steward influence, your character must be refined and stable. The discipline that feels unfair in the moment is often the very same thing that strengthens your foundation. And it's often that very thing that allows you to grow into the version of yourself that you've been wishing for on every birthday candle and shooting star. There's a big difference between being shamed and being shaped. Shame says you're wrong. Shaping says you're rising. Shame attacks your identity, whereas shaping refines it. If you can discern this difference, you can allow yourself to see that if what you are experiencing is shaping you, then you're not being singled out because you're failing or you're bad. You're being selected for expansion. It may look like others are allowed to be messy, immature, inconsistent, and still be embraced, loved, and admired. And you may feel that when you exhibit even a fraction of that messiness or immaturity, that the response is immediate and doubly harsh and firm. I'm not going to pretend like this doesn't hurt or feels incredibly frustrating, because it does. And I want to invite you to consider that those that you are witnessing are perhaps being held to the level they're currently capable of sustaining, and perhaps you are being held to the level that you're capable of growing into. If you're experiencing glimpses of this in your own life, I want to invite you to zoom out and ask yourself if what you're experiencing is shaping you into someone who is stronger, someone more regulated, someone more self aware, someone who's more capable of stewarding a bigger life. And then from here, I want to invite you to consider how you feel about this. For me, when I think about my life in this way, it makes me feel powerful, empowered, capable, and devoted. These are gifts that are lying amongst the rubble of expansion. Here's another example. You would never consider disciplining a child who is learning how to walk in the same way an athlete trains for the Olympics. The expectations are simply different because the potential is different. If your life is meant to reach a certain height, the precision that's required at the base must match the height. And I want to be clear, this doesn't mean for you to permit cruelty in your life. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to tolerate unfairness. The aim of this contemplation is to allow you to become curious about the standard being applied to you, especially if you've noticed it as a pattern throughout your life. Is it possible that the reason you're being corrected is because you're actually being seen in your capacity? And is it possible that you're not being micromanaged, but instead somehow mentored by life itself? Discipline builds trust. And when you learn how to regulate your impulses, you become someone others can rely on. You learn to pause before reacting, and then that becomes someone who creates safety in the environments around them. When you allow yourself to learn to take responsibility, you become someone whose word carries weight. And all of these are foundational qualities that are required for building a life that leaves an impact and a legacy, should you desire and choose to leave one. If you're someone who feels like you're not granted the same leniency, you may have internalized the belief that you're less lovable. And I want to take a moment to gently challenge this. What if instead of meaning that you're less lovable, this means that you're more capable? What if the reason you're not allowed to skate by in life is because skating by would diminish what you specifically are here to build? Imagine for a moment a builder who decides to skip reinforcement in the early stages of building their building because their structure somehow looks good enough on the ground level. This building may stand for a while, it may even look impressive for a time. But when a storm comes, when additional floors are added, or when the weight increases, cracks will form and the building will eventually fall. So, what if your life is the kind of life that's built for altitude, weight, and expanse? There is also something deeply empowering about recognizing that being held to a higher standard means you are seen as being capable of meeting it. People don't hold you accountable for qualities they don't believe you can embody. If you were perceived as fragile, incompetent, incapable, you would be excused more often. The fact is that leniency is something that's given in the places where expectation is low. This is the sort of realization that moves you from victimhood to responsibility and from comparison to ownership. Instead of asking, why do they get away with it and I don't? You allow yourself to consider the life that you're being prepared for. Perhaps you're being prepared to steward your influence with integrity. Perhaps you're being prepared to build relationships that require you to have emotional maturity. Perhaps you're being prepared to carry wealth, visibility, leadership, or impact in a way that doesn't implode under pressure. The world doesn't need more loosely built leaders. It needs anchored ones. It needs people whose inner discipline matches their outer success. It needs people whose character can sustain the height and weight of their ambition. And I know this can feel incredibly lonely. Being held to a higher standard can feel isolating because you're constantly wondering, why me? It can feel like you're constantly being refined while others are allowed to roam freely. But refinement doesn't have to mean restriction. It can mean that you're strengthening in a way that ensures when your life does expand, it won't collapse under its own weight. We must remember that the deeper the roots, the taller the tree can grow. Roots are invisible to the surface. They're built in the dark, but they determine everything about how high the tree can reach without falling. And here is where you can take back your power because you get to choose how you interpret the standard in which you're being held to. You can interpret it either as criticism or as a calling. You can interpret it as a rejection or as a recognition. Recognition says, I see what you're capable of. Recognition says, I will not let you settle. Recognition says that you are meant for more. The depth of your power lies in embracing your calling without resentment and in trusting that if the standard is high, you will rise to meet it. That if the discipline feels firm, you will strengthen within it. And if you are corrected, you are someone who refines in the feedback rather than the collapse. So instead of wishing for leniency, perhaps the invitation is to honor the standard, honor the playground in which you are designed to navigate, to thank the friction for the strength that's cultivating within you, and to recognize that the life you're building is intentional. Let high standards become the evidence that your life is meant to stand tall. Until next time.